I just want to say that, and I've been waiting for a long time to tell you, is that Under Their Thumb is by far my favorite rock memoir for so many reasons. It's really about you as well. But what you were able to do is just paint such a great picture of this time in New York City and my favorite era of the Rolling Stones so beautifully that I have a hard time even saying the words Almost Famous and Under Their Thumb at the same time, because yours, I think, is just far superior. And I think it's got a lot of mileage left.
Thanks, Steve. That's nice to hear. Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of my story could not have happened if I weren't in New York, and that the Stones were here at the same time, and that I was a huge fan of theirs, obviously, and I was a fan of journalism, and I wanted to marry the two together, and so and there was like the whole do-it-yourself vibe back then, and so I used to go to the record stores here when I was like 13, 14, 15 years old, and I would see fanzines, or like punk fanzines, especially like by 1977, 78. And I said, hey, why don't I do one of those for the Stones? And you can do that back then. You didn't need anyone's approval. You just needed a printing press, somewhere, which mine was my high school's mimeograph room. And, just decided I wanted to write about my favorite band. And that was it. And it just started so organically. I had no idea where it would lead. And, I had like no intentions of taking it to where it went.
Where'd you go to high school?
So it's a high school called South Shore, which no longer exists. South Shore High School in Brooklyn. And it has like a really idyllic name, but it was like nowhere near the shore. Actually, the closest body of water, literally, was the sewage treatment plant across the street, which smelled like rotten eggs every morning. But it was a really good school, actually. It was, at the time, the largest or most populated high school, second most populated high school in the entire United States. There were 6,600 kids in there. So it was easy to get lost there, literally and figuratively. But they had all these great programs that they offered kids. And so like, if you wanted to become a mechanic, which, some of the guys that I grew up with did, that was their highest aspiration. And they became mechanics, because there was actually like a mechanics class that had like little miniature cars in them that you could work on. And then they had a journalism class. And I said, well, I'm signing up for the journalism class. And Mr. Weber was my journalism teacher for 2 semesters. I'm still in touch with him all these years later, actually.
Where in Brooklyn was this?
So it's like southern Brooklyn. It's an area called Canarsie.
Sure.
Okay. It's where, what's his name? I'm forgetting his first name, but Hill from Goodfellas.
Yeah, Henry Hill.
Henry Hill, that's it. Henry, yeah. Henry Hill lived there, and Peter Criss from Kiss lived there for a bit. So it's a pretty colorful neighborhood. It was like 50% Jewish and 50% Italian. Mm-hmm. And my next book, actually, I'm going to be writing more about that neighborhood. And so I technically didn't grow up in Canarsie. I grew up in a neighborhood called Mill Basin, which was like the next neighborhood over. But I spent my entire school career from like kindergarten through 12th grade going to school in Canarsie.
I love Brooklyn.
Yeah.
Well, I have relatives in Crown Heights. I have a cousin from Canarsie. My ex-wife's grandmother came from Williamsburg. I'm in Chicago, but I always was fascinated with that place. And I mean, it's strange. I was reading about Ramblin' Jack Elliott recently, and he went to Midwood High School just a few years ahead of Woody Allen. And man, that guy reinvented himself.
Right. Yeah. In fact, to get to my childhood house, I would pass Midwood High on the train, and they had like a really nice football field. I was like impressed, And supposedly Woody Allen played a little bit of baseball there.
He says he was really good.
Yeah, right. You wouldn't think so, but yeah, I could see it. Big Brooklyn Dodger fan, of course.
Aside from being, what do you remember? Because it's, fan obviously is short for fanatic, and I'm one of those for many different people and things. But what was it about the Stones that really, because you came up during a very great time in music where there's so much happening, and a Brit would say, "Oh, these guys are old hat," if they're listening to the Clash or the Pistols or the Damned. What was it about the Stones that affected you?
See, that's the thing, because like I love the Clash. I loved the Sex Pistols when they came out. I loved the Ramones. And the thing is I would say Bullock's that, because the Stones to me, like, were one of those bands. And I know that sounds, unrealistic when you say, oh, well, they're playing stadiums and, and all that, compared to those other groups who started out in clubs or were still in clubs in the late 70s where the Stones are playing stadiums. But the Stones had that punk attitude. Obviously, Some Girls is like a post-punk album. And so, they had that attitude musically, and then just personally and physically. I mean, they're living in New York, Mick, Keith, and Ronnie. They are going to those nightclubs where they are literally getting on stage with, yes, some of the old blues guys like Chuck Berry or Matt Guitar Murphy, but they're also getting up on stage with people like Jim Carroll. So they are, Keith jammed with Jim Carroll on People Who Died at Trax nightclub on 72nd Street. So they're really out there, the Stones, in the late 70s. They're pressing the flesh and they're writing about New York City. So to me, they were like another New York band. And I'm sure if you were to ask the Ramones at the time, they would agree with you, or the Patti Smith Group. And of course, when you look at those bands, they all kind of had a Keith Richards figure in the band. I mean, as far back as the Dolls, obviously, Johnny Thunders, but even the Clash, to me, Mick Jones, was sort of patterning his look after Keith at that time period. And Blondie had Frank Infante, So to me, the Stones were like one of those bands, especially when the Some Girls album comes out. And the thing that I loved about them as a teenage kid who was sarcastic in his life, I mean, for me, sarcasm and humor is what got me through tough times in my life. That whole album, Some Girls, is dripping with sarcasm. And when you see the Stones being interviewed in the late 70s and throughout their whole career, it's full of sarcasm or, taking the piss, as they say in England. So to me, that's what appealed to me, this nice boy from Brooklyn who kind of needed that outlet, and appreciated their sarcasm and their, take no prisoners attitude. That's what really appealed to me.
And what Michael Bloomfield, rest in peace, would have coined some real brash Jew boy confidence.
Right.
Which is and I that's how
yeah. I mean, in my day-to-day life, I was like, a nice boy. And but to me, like, doing a fanzine was rebellious. And I still look back at it 40 plus years later and say that was like a rebellious thing to do. And that was my form of rebellion, where other kids, it was smoking and drinking or, vandalism, stuff like that. To me, at the time, I'm really telling you how I thought back then. I thought, like, that's too easy for rebellion. To me, I was a badass by doing a fanzine. That was punk. Doing a fanzine, and and granted, I didn't have anybody reading the fanzine the first few issues in the fall of 1978. And of course, that was the irony, is that who winds up liking the fanzine but the Rolling Stones themselves? Because in the late 70s, growing up in Brooklyn, it was all Tony Manero, and it was Saturday Night Fever. Right. I mean, that's what everyone wanted. The guys wanted to look like Tony Manero. The girls were only dating guys that looked like Tony Manero. And
you look like Keith.
Yeah, right. And I'm wearing my Free Keith button. No one knew what the hell I was talking about.
Right. That's amazing. Did you ever go into the city to see guys like Johnny Thunders or any of those people?
Oh, yeah. And also, I was lucky enough that there was a club in Brooklyn where Johnny Thunders used to come to, a club called Zappa's on Quentin Road in Brooklyn, that I started going to like in 1979. And so Johnny Thunders was playing there back then. And I remember going to see him like for the next few years there, as well as at Max's. And so, yeah, like every weekend and some weeknights, I would come into Manhattan. Either a friend would drive me or I'd hop on the D train, which has now switched to the B train. That's a whole long story. They switched the B train to the D train and a D train to the B train. But yeah, and go to places like Max's and CBGB's. But I was actually more of a Max's person, and see bands like Johnny Thunders. I saw the Ramones, and yeah, the Ramones came to Brooklyn to that club Zappa's, which was not named for Frank Zappa, by the way. It was named for like the in the Batman comics, how it would say Zap and Pow.
Yeah.
So anyway, they named a nightclub after that, Zappa's. But some great bands came through there.
It's amazing. What's even, I'm a father of a 10-year-old daughter, and that's really like, she's only 7 years away, or even less than a young Bill just traipsing through Manhattan by himself. Were your parents worried about you? Were they supportive? Like, what was that?
Well, my parents gave me a lot of rope. And the reason for that, which I will get into more in my next book, which I'm working on, is that they kind of had their hands full with my sister. Well, it's too long a story to get into here, but they were consumed with my sister, so they kind of let me get away with murder. And in some ways, you might say it was like reverse psychology, like let the kid do whatever he wants. And I turned into this good kid, and I didn't do drugs,
Right.
and my parents never got the call from the cops like, hey, come pick up your kid. So my parents really just let me do whatever I wanted. I would like leave the house. I remember once sleeping online for, of all things, NAC tickets, the NAC. And I left the house at like 10, 11 o'clock at night and just said, hey, I'm not coming home. I'm sleeping on 57th Street tonight. Like, okay, see you tomorrow.
Was it worth sleeping out?
They could trust me. Well, at the time it was.
Right.
That's a whole other story, which will be in my next book, actually.
Listen, man, that book might even be one of my other favorites.
I hope. Yeah.
No, it's great. I think that I was born in '70, so I do remember. I remember a couple things. One, the Stones on Saturday Night Live, and my father, it's like, oh, like these fagulas, like whatever, And just as he says that, I forgot.
Guessing Woody.
Yes, the when he licked Mick's cheek.
Right.
And it didn't freak me out. I was like, wow, that's what rock and roll guys do. And they're wearing leather, and they remind me of all that cool 50s greaser type stuff, and they're playing rock and roll. And it was one of those things. It's kind of like seeing your first porno.
Yeah. No, I mean, I was 16, so I viewed it a little differently than you did.
Yes.
But I knew, like, they're just being badass. They know they're on live TV, and if Mick Jagger wants to lick Ron Wood's face, he's going to. And I knew it had nothing to do with homosexuality.
Right.
Not that there's anything wrong with it, if it was, but I knew that this was all just, just a big FU to the audience and all that, and they're just being sarcastic and playing around. And it was punk. It was, the definition of punk at that time.
Do you think that was a New York thing that was impacting their aesthetics, or were they were pretty much on their way to that sort of that punk thing? I mean, it goes back to when they were just starting out, but there's something very unique and urban about that record that do you think Ron Wood brought that with him?
He certainly did, but I don't think he was the only one, right? Because, Mick and Keith were living here. And so Mick is going out to nightclubs. I mean, like Mick, earlier that year in 1978, went to go see the Jam at CBGB's, And so, like I said, they are part of the fabric. They were part of New York. And of course, Mick is also going to Studio 54. You know, Keith was going to Studio 54 too, but usually to see bands like, you know, James Brown or whatever. But they were part of New York City, and you know, this was their New York period. You know, the way Picasso had his blue period, the Stones had their New York period.
Got
And so, you know, Some Girls is a totally New York album. Emotional Rescue 2, I mean, starts with Mick saying, you know, hey, what am I doing here on 8th Street and 6th Avenue? You know, is the first line of the Emotional Rescue album. So yeah, I mean, New York was in their blood.
Do you remember the first words out of a Rolling Stones mouth directed at you?
Well, other than a song, which I'll explain in a second, it was, I think I just popped a button on my trousers. Hope my trousers don't fall down. It was because my sister was blasting the Yayas album. And so I had no idea what it was. I was 10 years old. So it was after my 10th birthday in 1972. So that album is like a couple years old already. And she is blasting it from like her Woolworth's phonograph. So, you know, I'm exaggerating when I say blasting, but I could hear it from her bedroom. And I hear this guy saying, oh, is everybody ready? You know, and which is Sam Cutler introducing the band to the stage. And then I hear like these violent sounds, and it's, you know, Keith pounding out the rip to Jumping Jack Flash. And then at the end of that song, it's Mick saying, yeah, I think I popped your button on my trousers. Hope my trousers don't fall down. You know, and I'm like, what the hell is this? You know, and I asked my sister, and you know, she showed me their album, and you know, the Yaya's album, and all these other albums, and I was hooked. I was instantly hooked, because these were the badass guys who were getting away with stuff I couldn't get away with at age 10. You know, and it's been a love affair ever since, I guess.
But when you actually encountered them in person for the first
Is
time.
that what you were asking? I went on a tangent.
No, but that was a great tangent. I'm glad you misunderstood.
So it was, you know, I waited for them, again, a New York story. I waited for them outside Danceteria nightclub, and it was June of 1980. I was 17 years old. It was literally 2 days after my high school graduation, and they were celebrating the Emotional Rescue album. And I knew that they were having an afternoon party to celebrate the album for the press. And I was, you know, not a recognized member of the press, so I was not invited. But I found out about this party from others who were getting in, and I just waited for them to come out. And they come out, and I see Keith and I see Ronnie, and people were surrounding Keith at that moment. So I went up to Ronnie, handed him a copy of my fanzine. I had already been running the fanzine for like a year and a half at that point. And I basically said, hey, here's the latest issue of my fanzine. You know? And Ronnie Wood said something like, oh, it's great. And I figured he's humoring me. But then he actually like opens it and looks at it for a second and says something like, how'd you have all that? And it had to do with the fact that I had like a little preview of the Emotional Rescue album in this issue of my fanzine, which I got because I took my fanzine very seriously. Like I said, I was in journalism class for a year at high school. And so I developed sources the way I was taught by my journalism teacher. You need to develop sources, and you need to double check your sources. And so long story short, I met up with some people who kind of knew the Stones just by living in New York. You know, if you wanted to meet the Stones, you could meet the Stones. And so I had this little exclusive in my fanzine, even though I was 17 years old. And I knew eventually I would meet the Rolling Stones. It was just inevitable. We're all here in New York City. You know, they're drinking the same tap water that I am, and they're walking the same sidewalks that I am.
That's
it's
so
bound
cool.
to happen. And so it happened at age 17.
What was, were people, it had been around for about a year and a half. How were you circulating them? Out of a record store, out of? Like,
right, exactly. So on Avenue U in Brooklyn, there was a store called Zigzag Records, and which sold like used records and imports. You know, if you wanted the latest, you know, Elvis Costello import 45, that's where you went if you lived in Brooklyn. And it was just a quick bus ride for me or, quick car ride. And yeah, so the guy there said he would sell them, for like a quarter a piece, and we will split the profits, 12 and a half cents each. And I mean, I brought my first issue in there, and I went in like a month later to collect on the payment. And he said, well, we sold just one. And he said, here's 13 cents. You owe me a half a penny. Literally, I'm not making that up. But he decided to keep stocking it. But anyway, yeah, so that's how I did it at first. And then about a half a year into it, actually, I took an ad in Trouser Press magazine, or actually, I think it was like an offshoot of Trouser Press called Trouser Press Collectors magazine. And I did get like a few dozen people just from this little tiny ad that I took in the back, a classified ad, something like, if you're a Stones fan, you can't be without Beggars Banquet, something like that. And I think I was charging, I was charging 35 cents an issue through the mail at that point, plus a 15-cent stamp. So I think I was offering you just one issue at a time. And then once you got this one sample issue, I would try to hook you in and say, hey, if you want 6 issues, it'll cost you $3. And so once people got the sample issue and said, hey, I like this, then they would send me $3 in cash, and these dollar bills would show up to my house in Brooklyn. My parents were like, what the hell is this?
He's making money, leave him alone.
Right, he's making money, leave him alone. Right, $3 times like 20 people.
But still, it's enough to, it's kind of like Navin Johnson and the Jerk when the new phone books come.
The new phone books are here, right.
Somebody.
Right.
But okay, so there's so many questions, I want to, I'll get to Freddie Sessler later, but so Ronnie Wood takes the magazine from you and he's impressed. What happens after that? How do they get in touch with you? Do you keep showing up?
I'll tell you what happened that particular moment. So it was Ronnie and Keith and Bill Wyman were all in the same limo. Mick took a separate limo, which is indicative of the Stones dynamic. And so Ronnie takes it into the limo, and for some reason the window was open of the back of the limo. And so I could see in for a few seconds before they pull out, and Ronnie has it in his hands, and Keith like sort of elbows Ronnie, and I, what the hell is that, man? And Ronnie is like, that kid over there, he just gave that to me. And they both look at it, and they look at me, and they smile, and then the limo pulls off. And so that's that day. And it's like you just said, with Neighbor Johnson, it's like the new phone books are here. Like they know who I am. That's it. Let's take it from there. So then I figured, well, now that the Stones know who I am, I can start dropping these issues off at their office. And again, this has to do with the accessibility of the time. Like you can't just walk into an office building now, post 9/11, but I could do that. As a 17, 18-year-old kid, I turned 18 that September, 1980. And I started NYU. So after class, I would go to the Stones office, like once a month, and bring the latest issue up to the Stones office, like a stack of them. And they would tell me up there, like, oh yeah, we're passing it along to the Stones. And I really, didn't believe them, even though I was this young, naive kid. I still figured that, well, they're just humoring me. But what started happening is I would start to go to these nightclubs where I would see the Stones, or there would be paparazzi who I got to know who would be hanging out, trying to get pictures of the Stones coming out of nightclubs or coming out of their apartments. And they would see the Stones holding my fanzine.
Wow.
And then they would tell me, like, oh, I saw Mick like coming out of his limo and going into his apartment building on Central Park West, and he was holding your fanzine.
That's so cool.
It just like snowballed from there, right? And then I would go to these clubs, and if I had like 1 minute with Keith, and you'd figure out where they're going to be, because they love the blues, they love reggae. So you go to some obscure reggae show, and there's Keith sitting there. And again, they're so accessible. They didn't have bodyguards with them. Maybe the club would provide someone to just stand at the table or whatever. but I could still, say hey to Keith, and I would always walk around with issues in my pocket. If you see photos of me from back then, and if I'm wearing like a blazer, you could see like an issue sticking out of the pocket at all times.
Aside
But
from slightly graying hair, Bill, you look the same.
thank you.
You honestly do. You have good genes. I need
It
to.
sounds cliche, but I guess rock and roll keeps you young. I mean, I don't know.
Well, that's why I love that. I used to hate those Keith Richards jokes when I was a kid, like, how old he looked and how unhealthy he was. I was like, he's outlived everybody.
Knock on wood, yeah, right. I mean, so far. But anyway, so I would see Keith like at some club and say, hey, here's my latest issue. And he's like, yeah, I just read it on the can, I've already got this one. It's like, wow, Keith Richards is reading my stuff on the can, And right when you're like 18, 19 years old, it's like, oh my God, the Stones really know who I am. And so it just sort of snowballs, and one thing leads to another. Like I was just talking to you about the paparazzi. So now what's happening is the paparazzi know that the Stones know who I am, so they can get the Stones to pose for a second outside of some nightclub or their apartment building and say, hey, I'm shooting this for Beggars Banquet for Bill German. And they would stop and pose. Yeah, all right, for Bill German. Okay. Oh. Yeah. And it's just like this beautiful cycle. And then the paparazzi, and also like other legitimate rock photographers like Bob Gruen, they're giving me their stuff for free, and I always said to them, eventually I will pay you when I start making some money out of it. And so that was just like the handshake agreement, the kind of thing that you could do in the late 70s, early 80s. And they knew that this was a labor of love for me, and that I wasn't making a lot of money off of it, charging $3 a year or $4 a year or $5 a year. And like I said, it just sort of snowballed. And then one day what happens is the Stones management called me up and say, hey, Mick and Keith love your fanzine, and they want to turn it into the official newsletter of the Rolling Stones. They're going to advertise it in their next album. You'll get to interview them, go to their recording sessions. Is that okay with you?
Where were you when you got that call?
Literally where I was?
Yes.
I was in Keith Richards' pharmacist's apartment, which was now my apartment. So
really?
I do mention that and I just heard from him today, by the way, Keith Richards, old pharmacist. Not a joke, not a joke.
No kidding.
But anyway, so long story short, I knew that I had to get out of Brooklyn for various reasons. I loved my family and all that, but you hit 20 years old and you just got to fly the coop already. But also I wanted to be closer to the Stones. Yes, Brooklyn is part of New York City and Manhattan is part of New York City, but you still need to take the subway, And so there's a story in my book about how Keith once told me to come to the Plaza Hotel to interview him, like, come right now. And by the time I got there, he had, supposedly fallen asleep. I got there at 1 o'clock in the morning after he told me to come at like 11:30, 12 o'clock at night. And I said, no, I need to be there in Manhattan 24 hours a day and live there. Anyway, just, serendipitously, one day, Keith's personal assistant, who really was a licensed pharmacist, his name is Smee, he's all over my book. And so, like I said, I just dealt with him today. That's a bad word. But I spoke with him today. And so he one day says to me, I'm leaving the city. Do you want to take over my apartment? And I'm like, of course I want to take over your apartment. And it was like under $400. I still had to take in a roommate. And it was just this, like roach infested tiny apartment. Anyway, so when their management called me, they actually called my house in Brooklyn, spoke to my mother, who said, oh no, Billy lives in Manhattan now. And so they called me in Manhattan. So it was the Stones management calling me in the summer of 1983, August of 1983, and saying, what I just told you, Mick and Keith love your fanzine. They want to turn it into the official newsletter. They're going to advertise it in the next album, which is coming out like just 3 months from now. The Undercover album came out in November of 83. And so everything just, was like at a whirlwind pace. And I'm getting contracts from like the Stones lawyers. And I'm like 20 years old, 21 by the time
Were
it
you,
all.
were you still going to classes at school?
So no. So I started NYU September 1980, dropped at, well, no, I took a leave of absence a year later to follow the Tattoo U tour in the fall of 81. And my parents let me do that because I promised them I would go back. And I lived up to my word. I am a man of my word. And so in February of 82, I did go back, and then dropped out a year after that. And it was literally after I hung out with the Stones at a party in February of 83, like a week into the spring semester at NYU. And I just knew, like, this is what I want to do with my life, is to hang out with the Rolling Stones and write about it. And it was because Keith and Ronnie were so nice to me at this party that I just said, I think I see a future here. And at that point, I was already like 4.5 years into the fanzine. So like I said, so I dropped out for good from NYU in February of 83. And then in August of 83, I get that phone call. And then I move out of the house in between that, in June of 83, move into that apartment previously lived in by Keith Richards' pharmacist, and who just let me take over the lease. And then, yeah, August, I get that phone call. November, there is a flyer, subscribe to Beggars Banquet, in 1 million copies of the Undercover album.
Gosh, did you have fun on that tour, the Tattoo U tour, when you were flying around?
Yeah. Well, I went up and down the East Coast. I didn't like go out to California, but yeah, it was fun and exciting. And I had my first like real backstage experience. I got to go to Keith's birthday party backstage in Virginia, Hampton, Virginia. Yeah. I mean,
Is that where you met his father? Keith's.
No, you know what? Keith himself was not in touch with his father for 20 years. And they finally reunited in 1982. So the first time I met Keith's father, I think, was in 83, if memory serves.
It's one of my favorite lines in any book. And you're gonna have to reenact it right now when you said you asked Keith's father a question and his answer was, do you remember?
Yes, I know what you're talking about. Yeah, so this is 1993 at Keith's birthday party, 50th birthday party. It was a surprise party here in New York. And so I went up to him and just asked him, just casually, oh, so where were you 50 years ago? And he said, 50 years ago today. And he says, I was on the battlefield fighting for my country. And I was like, oh shit, yes, of course, December 1943. And I was like, wow, why didn't I think of that?
It's still great.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
No, I love that line. And just even the story, was there a point that you felt the sort of giddy, it sounds like you were always trying to carry yourself with the moxie and coolness of a journalist. Did you ever feel like, oh shit, I blew it, I put my foot in my mouth, and then you kind of grew out of that till the point where you're the fanzine creator?
It was always like a delicate balance of being a fan and a journalist. And, there's the line in Almost Famous, don't befriend the bands, and it was like already sort of too late for that. But in the fanzine, I tried to avoid like giving reviews of their albums, that kind of thing. I really just wanted to report the news. And I know that, it's not like earth-shattering news, it's entertainment news. We're not curing cancer here.
Right.
And I never lost that perspective. I think that, contributed to my longevity with them, is knowing, like, let's not take this too seriously. It is only rock and roll, but enjoy it. And I knew that fans loved, getting that inside scoop of what they're doing, and reading the interviews. As far as putting my foot in my mouth, I'm sure there were times, but I don't know. I think, again, the thing to my longevity is knowing when to just be that fly on the wall, and, knowing just when to shut up, you know. I mean, I have a story in the book about there was one time, and it might be the only time, that I was in a room alone with all five members of the Stones. And it was during the video shoot for Harlem Shuffle here in New York. And there were, like, a lot of people in their entourage were there, but at one moment, like, just everyone had left this room. It was sort of like a green room that had some food that was brought in, some Chinese food. And I look around and realize at that point, it's just me and the five Stones. And you just don't say anything. Like, why would you want to say anything? And they just had like this interaction amongst themselves, and they were like making some sort of joke about the Harlem Shuffle video shoot that I didn't fully understand. Charlie cracked a joke. It was a reference to their childhood. He made some joke that the suits that they were wearing reminded him of, they were wearing like zoot suits for this shoot. And Charlie said, "Oh, it reminds him of some TV show or something that they knew as kids in England, some early TV show from the 1950s, like when they were teenagers." And I'm like, what do I have to contribute? Just be a fly on the wall. And so I did that in a lot of situations. And I think that's why they let me hang around. They knew that I wasn't going to be a pain in the ass. I wasn't coming to steal their drugs. I wasn't coming to steal their silverware, because shit like that really did happen, And I saw a lot of people burn themselves out like the first time they get to hang out. Something as innocent as I once saw a very attractive woman, and it was a bunch of us. We're all in a room in Keith's hotel room, and Keith is blasting some Jimmy Reed music, and she goes and like changes the song. It's like, oh my God, like, that's it. You will never be welcome back. So those kinds of things, or someone who does like Bogart the blow, and they knew that I wasn't into drugs. So like, hey, Bill could hang out. He's not taking our drugs, and he seems like a good, innocent kid. He's not stealing from us.
And that probably says a lot, not so much with the drug stuff, but obviously with them it did. But there's certainly a bit of trust that was built, because by the time that they enlisted you to be part of the actual organization with the fanzine, I can't remember them being any bigger than they were in '83 and '84, especially after Tattoo You. I mean, that came out when I was in junior high, but even that Undercover of the Night video was always being played. And to this day, it's one of the coolest videos I've ever seen. But at the same time, you're part of the constellation.
Yeah, but having said what you just said, you have to remember that in the mid '80s they go into that funk where, yes, they're still famous, they're still the Rolling Stones, but they start believing that they might break up, and that's when the tension starts with Mick and Keith, and they sort of go through these midlife crises. And as weird as it sounds to say, people like Keith Richards and Ron Wood needed friends and needed support. And they're living in New York. I'm living in New York, in Manhattan at that point. And so they welcome me in, because they need friends. I know that sounds so weird, that the big famous Rolling Stones need like personal friends and people they can trust. And that's it. I think there was, the trust factor that allowed me in. And it just worked. It was just like the perfect storm, I guess, of location, 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 and then also just situation, situation, situation of where their heads were at that point in their lives and in their careers.
Do you reflect back on that time a lot? Obviously, it's how I know of you, but
I do. In fact, even when I go see them in concert, as recently as a couple of years ago, I see them in front of me, but my mind goes back to those times, of like sitting in Ron Wood's kitchen. And so I sometimes get distracted at a Stone show by all the memories, and I have some great ones, I must say. Yeah.
Did you meet guys like Ian McClagan?
Oh yeah, yeah, of course.
Oh, I loved him.
He was like the sweetest guy in the world. I mean, such a nice guy. Yeah, and I was really upset when he passed, which is already like 7 years.
Yeah.
So almost 7 years.
I
Yeah.
know.
Yeah, he was really great. And then, you just on the periphery, you meet people like Chuck Berry, even if it's just for a second. And then Bo Diddley, who I met a bunch of times. And he, to this day, is one of my favorite people who ever walked the earth. Contrasted to a Chuck Berry, who could be an asshole, of course, albeit a genius. You then have Bo Diddley, who's also an innovator and a genius, but just the personality is just that he was just the sweetest guy in the world. And so I spent a bunch of time with him.
Was Jerome still alive?
I don't think so.
The Maraca guy.
Jerome Green. No, boy, didn't he die early? I don't know.
I think so.
My Bo Diddley history on that one. I think
I obviously don't know. I just love that whole setup.
The whole song, Leave It to Jerome and all that. And the Duchess. Yeah. No, I think Jerome died like in the 60s, I think. But the point is that Bo was touring like with his own band, and then hooked up with Ronnie Wood in 1987 to do their Gunslingers tour, which toured I think mostly the Northeast, and then eventually they went out west and then like went to Japan and all that. But anyway, so it was through Ron Wood. I mean, and that's the thing, when you get introduced to someone like Bo Diddley by Ron Wood, it gives you like an instant entree in a sense. And so that happened to me a bunch of times. Well, yes, when Keith Richards or Ron Wood introduce you to someone, you're not, they don't approach you as just a regular fan, even if you are a regular fan. Right? I mean, Keith introduces me to Eric Clapton. So,
What was it like? Do you remember what would they, if you were fulfilling their need for friendship? Obviously, I don't want to know the conversations, but would you guys talk about music? Like, what were these, in essence? Because I think you did capture their essence so famously in the book, but in hanging out one-on-one, where you must have been just in heaven.
Yeah, to be able to relate to them on a human level and to see them like almost every day. So some of it was like just really inane day-to-day stuff, and I think in a weird way, that's maybe, I guess maybe the word is charm of my book, or, I don't know, the appeal of my book is that I'm just showing them as regular people at home, and that they have wives and kids, that they're dealing with on a day-to-day basis while juggling their career. And so, yeah, we had conversations about music. They taught me a lot about music I didn't know. It's like you sit around with them and they're jamming on, oh boy, what's the name of the song, the Sam Cooke song? If you ever change your mind, leave it all behind. Bring It Home.
Bring It On Home, yeah.
So Keith and Ronnie are playing that song in Ronnie's basement. It's just the three of us. And then Keith points out to me that the person on the original song doing the backing vocals, like the alternate, bring it on home to me, yeah, 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 yeah. The person doing the other yeah is Lou Rawls. And these are just like the little factoids you find out directly from Keith Richards as you're sitting in Ron Wood's basement after they just finished jamming.
Isn't that wild?
By Sam Cooke, right?
Yeah, so, they went to high school together, Sam Cooke and Lou Rawls.
Oh, did they? Okay.
They were in like sort of competing gospel groups.
Ah, okay. I did not know that.
What about, okay, so there's all these people in this constellation, as I said, and I love that you still keep in touch with their pharmacists. But after the book came out, and as who was Keith's? I don't know if it was a woman, a sort of this ball-breaking woman that you endeared yourself to, but it wasn't always easy.
Yes.
Her last name was Rose.
Jane Rose.
Yes.
Well, she's worked with the Stones. Right now, she is the longest running Stones employee. Actually, in history, I guess she's the longest. She started working for them in 1975. So that's 46 years already. And then became Keith's manager in the 1980s. And so, yes, she was the hardest person for me to write about because she helped me in so many ways, but at the same time, she could be very tough. Keith addresses it in his own book. And so, so my book is coming out again next year. It's being reissued in 2022. And I literally, as I speak to you at the end of August 2021, I literally just handed in over the last few days the bonus chapters that are going to appear
Awesome.
in this 2022 edition. And I have a whole thing about Jane Rose in there, saying how she was the hardest person for me to write about because she had this very generous side, helping me out with the fanzine. I would sit in her office for hours with her giving me all this information. Keith is going to do this. Keith, saw John McEnroe on Tuesday, had dinner with John McEnroe, and then he's going into the studio and he's going to do that. And it's all great stuff for the fanzine. But at the same time, she could be tough, to put it in one word.
And they wouldn't intercede on your behalf. You had to do it.
Right. So anyway, it's funny you bring up Jane Rose because I write about that and how she was so difficult for me to write about in the original edition of the book. And I go into a whole story about my relationship with her since the book came out, which I won't reveal now.
Yeah, no, I can't wait to read. Please do an Audible version for that as well.
Yeah, well, right now it's not up to me. It might be up to my new publisher, a company called Backbeat Books. And we'll see. And the original, one came out. There was an Audible version. I think that's like gone now.
You got to narrate it.
I should have.
No, but you should just book studio time, read the whole thing, and give it to them.
I agree. In principle, I agree. I don't even know if I'm allowed to do that on my own right now,
I know.
contractually speaking. But yeah, like I think I said to you in some message in the past years, like the author is like the low person on the totem pole.
Isn't that sad?
So, it really is.
What have you? I do want to ask you about, because I lived in Los Angeles. I think it's around the time I contacted you, and you had done something at the library. You actually were very helpful to me because I had a book that came out, and you gave me a good suggestion as to contacting the libraries. And I got some gigs out of my own book, but I went to a party somewhere in the hills at a friend's house, and Rob Fraboni was there.
Sure.
And I said, the first thing out of my mouth was like, I want to make a film about, or just a documentary about Freddie Sessler, only because he struck me as such an interesting guy. And if you could just tell me just a little about him. I know it's not entirely a happy story, but he's certainly a character and has his place in Keith's book and in history.
Yeah. Freddie, where do you begin? So Freddie is a Holocaust survivor, born in 1923, and he lived in Krakow. And when he was 15, Hitler invaded Poland, and Freddie and his family got placed into work camps. And one night, shortly after they were in the camps, Freddie and his brother make a daring escape and are successful. And he winds up going to England, working for the Allies as a translator because he could speak Polish, English, German, and Russian. I mean, just an amazing character. And then after the war, he winds up working in Germany, in West Germany, working for, is it Mercedes-Benz? One of the car manufacturers there. And then and goes to Hamburg and starts to see all these bands there. And now some of this may be apocryphal because it comes from Freddie. And at one point in my book, I give like the whole page of the story he told me of his life, of how he went from a work camp to like becoming Keith Richards' best friend. You know, um, and I say, even if 10% of this story is true, it's still an amazing story. And my estimate is only 10% of it is true. So there's really no way to know exactly. Um, but the point is, Freddie really did get to know like some of the old jazzers, like Billie Holiday, because eventually Freddie winds up in New York, and he works for a restaurant here, like as a busboy during the jazz era, and gets to know all these people, Lionel Hampton, Billie Holiday, and all that. And so he was just into music, you know, and back then jazz was the rock and roll of its day. And so then when the Beatles and Stones come around, he, you know, migrates to the Beatles and the Stones. He claims that he knew John Lennon. He claims that he knew Eric Clapton, and that Eric Clapton wrote the song Hello, Old Friend about him. Um, and then he befriends all the Stones, including Brian, but that just somehow he and Keith are the ones that really connect, because Keith is obsessed with World War II to this day. And, you know, and they lived through it. And then, well, more or less, they were babies, but yeah. And well, and you know, that's the thing. Freddie has had 20 years on Keith. So Keith looked up to Freddie sort of as a surrogate father, because like I said earlier, Keith and his father were estranged for about 20 years. From 1962 to 82, Keith and his father did not talk to each other.
Wow.
So filling that void was a guy like Freddie, who was Keith's father's age. In fact, they both died the same year, in 2000. So, you know, Keith just gravitates to this guy who had access to some very good drugs, supposedly, you know, pharmaceutical level drugs, and who was very loyal to the band. Freddie was very loyal. And so Keith starts his book talking about Freddie, you know, taking one for the team, and saying that that the drugs belonged to him when they were busted in Arkansas in 1975 in a car that they were all in. Freddie says, yeah, the drugs were mine, you know. And so, you know, I got to know Freddie, and he was like one of my biggest supporters throughout the years. And just, you know, like he was just a mixture of things. He could be totally sophisticated one day and totally vulgar, you know, the next day. And that's Freddie. He was just, you know, an enigma wrapped in a riddle.
Yeah. So just because I don't want to take up all of your time, you know, any thoughts about, I mean, it's a sad week because of, you know, Charlie passing away, but, you know, what are some of the things that you've been thinking about? I know that you weren't that close with him, but still you knew him.
Yeah. Ironically, mostly because of geography, Charlie was the one band member that I didn't really like develop a real relationship with. Like even Bill Wyman was like really nice to me, and you know, relatively speaking to Charlie, Bill Wyman was sort of outgoing, where Charlie was always much more introverted. And I always felt like, just give Charlie his space. That was just my attitude. It might not have been other people's attitudes. And, you know, I'm seeing all these fans posting their pictures of them with Charlie, you know, that they met him for like 1 minute. Mm-hmm. But I just felt like my long-term relationship with him will be like a non-relationship in a sense. And so I never bothered him. And I make a joke in the book that I don't even think he knows who I am, but he did know who I was. But I just like maintain this distance on purpose, because I knew that he and I were so different in so many ways. Like, you know, you and I were discussing earlier that Mick, Keith, and Ronnie really became New Yorkers for several years. Charlie Watts has always been British, and like very British, not even London, like out of London British, country British, really? And somewhat eccentric, like in the greatest way. You know, he collected cars even though he didn't drive. Like expensive cars, like Lamborghinis that would just sit in the backyard. He collected horses. He and his wife would go to Poland once a year and buy a new horse every year. And there's a story supposedly that they would let the horses roam through the house. I don't know if that's true or not. It would be an incredible cleanup job. And They also loved sheepdogs. They had a bunch of sheepdogs. He collected stuff from the American Civil War. Here's a British guy fascinated with the American Civil War and had all this memorabilia from the Civil War. So we had like these other, hobbies. And I just was like, let him have, his world that he escaped into and that he loved.
And he loved jazz. He was a real.
He was a big jazz fan, which I don't, relatively speaking to what I know about rock and roll, like I know nothing about jazz, or at least his era of jazz.
Mhm.
But right, so he loved jazz. He would have preferred, being on stage in a tiny nightclub each night rather than being in a big stadium playing rock and roll. He would have rather have just played jazz. But, he had this relationship, he was married to his wife, Shirley, for 57 years. And he was married to Mick and Keith, in a sense, for 58 years. And so he never wanted to leave them the way he never left his wife. He didn't want to leave Mick and Keith and the fans. He was very loyal in that sense. He was the backbone, and the symbol of stability. That was Charlie. That's the big loss this week of like, wow, this guy was the backbone of it all. So, we'll see where it all goes. I don't know. I make no predictions. Supposedly they're going to continue with their tour that they had planned, to start a month from today, I think.
They might call you.
They might call me, right?
Did you know Stu?
So I met Stu in 1981.
Okay.
And then of course he passed in 1985. And I met him in February of 81 when I was 18 years old, and I interviewed him about a side project he was doing with Charlie called Rocket 88. It was a jazz band, a boogie woogie jazz band, and they released their first album. And Stu came to New York to talk about it. The album came out on Atlantic Records, and so I met him at the Stones office. I'm 18 years old, kind of nervous, even though I had met Mick and Keith and Ronnie, and all that. I was more nervous, I think, to meet Stu because of his no bullshit attitude. I mean, he's like such a purist. Like he put down the Beatles. He said something like, "The Beatles are proof that nothing good ever came out of Liverpool." He had that kind of sense of humor and like this sense of purity all the time. I think he just didn't like that the Beatles became so famous or what. I don't know. He used to call the Stones my showers of shit.
He loved golf too.
My 3-chord wonders, right? And he loved golf, and he would play golf with like non-celebrities, non-rock stars. That's what he preferred. So he's just this very humble guy, like Charlie, And so anyway, I met him a few times between 81 until his death in 85. And so the reprint of my book, actually, the way it stands now is I'm going to be reprinting that interview that I did with him in 1981. Because of all the interviews that I've done with the Stones, I've interviewed Mick and Keith and Ronnie and Bill Wyman and Mick Taylor. The one I get asked about the most is that one that I did with Ian Stewart when I was just 18. And it's not like the greatest interview. I look back at it now like, oh my God, why didn't I ask him this and ask him that? I was given some ground rules, which is like, he's here to discuss this jazz album that he had just come out with Charlie Watts. But still, like, oh my God, I should have asked him this and that. But it's still like a really interesting interview. And, he didn't do many, obviously, because he was always a background guy. And then for the saddest of reasons, he hasn't done any interviews in, almost 40 years.
I'll tell you though, I'm thrilled that the book is going to have a second life.
Thanks. Yeah, I'm trying to work on it every day.
I'm the president of the Bill German fan club, Great Lakes region.
That's very nice of you to say.